Hi everyone, I'm your host, Arlen Schumer, and welcome to one of my pop culture presentations. Get ready to be both educated and entertained, what I call edutainment. And when you're done, please be sure to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. That is the last of 18 of the villains of Doctor Who that I illustrated originally for a book cover, a book about the villains of Doctor Who called A World of Demons, the Villains of Doctor Who. And not just the front cover, but a wraparound cover that features all 18 of the villains you've just seen. The book by Fayetteville Mafia Press won't be coming out for a year until November. They publish media tie-in type books, as you can see in some of these on their website. And there's the page on the Doctor Who book. But once I realized it was a wraparound book cover, I said, you know, this would make a great poster. So I turned the book cover into a poster that I put on my poster site, Pop Culture Man, to sell. You go to that website and you can see it right there. You scroll down, you can get each individual one as a 16 by 20 print. And that led me to tonight saying, you know what, this should make, I think, a really fun webinar to show the process of how I turn the villains of Doctor Who into what I call the art of photo illustration. Anyway, my name is Arlen Schumer. For those of you who don't know me or haven't seen my previous webinars, if you go to my website, arlenschumer.com, the homepage features my illustration work as a comic book style illustrator. You can see in this promotional ad the types of illustration I've done, trying to bring the comic book look into commercial illustration, similar to the way Roy Lichtenstein brought comic book art into the fine art world. And I've done it over the years in both advertising and editorial usage. One of the campaigns I worked on years ago was for Three Musketeers, and these were actual comic book style ads printed on the back of comic book covers. There's the finished illustration that I designed and illustrated. But look at what the art director of the ad agency originally gave me. Now, not all art directors and ad agencies can draw. Some of them can draw at this level, some better, some worse. But my job, you know, some illustrators would just take this image, stick it on a light box, trace over it, meaning maintain the comic book style layout, but just make it better art. But I don't do that. This is my rough sketch of that same story from that ad agency, but just made into a better piece of artwork. I try to take what I'm given and make it better. So that, what you're looking at is about maybe 5.5 inches by 4 inches, or yeah, 6 by 3 or something like that. And then I enlarge it, and on a light box, this is all pre-computer, do what I would call a tight pencil version of it. And then I would ink that in black line and then scan it into the computer and color it in Photoshop. Now, the other kinds of comic work I try to do is creating custom superheroes to fit clients and editorial ideas and things like T-Mobile Man. So one of my past projects was I had to create superheroes of dentistry for, believe it or not, a dental insurance company. And that finished image, that was the cover of their annual report that year, that was treated to look like a comic book. Now, that 8.5 by 11 roughly size piece starts out as a thumbnail sketch where only I really know what's going on, but you get a sense of what's going on based on what I just showed you. Now, that thumbnail sketch, only a couple of inches big, I would, scan that in, blow it up, maybe again to 6 by 3, and make what I would call maybe a rough pencil, and then blow that up bigger and make a tight pencil, and then blow that up bigger, scan it, print it out, and ink it on the reverse on a light box, the finished ink drawing. There's the background, and the background, of course, in gray tones, just to get a sense of the feel in order to lay in the coloring in Photoshop. And there's your finished image. And then I would say my kind of third specialty within comic book art for advertising and editorial usage is what I call finding your inner superhero, where I turn real people into superheroes, as you can see on some of these pieces in this promotion piece, and where I try to maintain the photographic look, or what I would call photo illustration in a way. And that brings us to tonight and the art of photo illustration, which is what I would call this body of work that I just recently produced. And let's just start right in the upper right corner with the first Doctor Who villain, a Cyberman. Now, keep in mind, I've never even seen a single episode of Doctor Who. I've known about it because of my interest in pop culture, but for whatever reason, I just never sought it out. But you can't watch everything, but I certainly respected it. But I had to do my research into each one of these villains in order to give them the right illustrative identity in a way. So, I mean, the Cybermen, I wanted to start with them. I chose them, first of all, I went in alphabetical order, so they were actually the first, but it made sense because they're one of Doctor Who's oldest villains. Remember, Doctor Who goes back, I believe, to 1962. Of course, an English production from the BBC. But this is a current modern version of the Cybermen. But look how far they go back. I mean, this is almost looking like ancient African mask relics, but they're not. These are early Cybermen. And this is all photo reference I find on the internet. Every single image that you see, but you can see how this image over the years the last 60 years of how the Cybermen developed. But then in recent years, once the kind of Japanese influence model took off, we no longer, we have the more up-to-date current Cybermen appearance. But I kept looking for the right piece of photo reference, and that's part of the art of photo reference, is finding just the right piece. And nope, it wasn't that. And this almost, keep in mind, I'm doing portraits. I knew these were going to be roughly 8x10s and that I would blow them up as posters to 16x20 to give them that kind of enlarged look. But then I found this image, and there was something about the tilt of the head that felt more alive to me, ironically, that these are, of course, Cybermen. They're a fusion, kind of like, I think the Borg from Star Trek Next Generation probably stole the concept, because the Cybermen are also mixtures of human and reality, a human and cybernetics. And then I do a pencil drawing over the photograph. So this is, in a sense, the art of drawing from photographs. It's not robotic tracing. You still have to know how to draw. There's a lifetime of penciling in this single drawing. And then I've turned, rather than inking with traditional felt tip marker printed out on Xerox paper, I'd scan my pencil into the computer, print it out, and ink it on reverse, and then scan the black ink in. But, in Photoshop, you can just make the image dark enough. And I like the kind of rawness of my pencils versus I've always felt my inks were a little too stiff. So once I lay in the Photoshopped color with my pencil drawing, and then, of course, we need a background. Well, I go on the internet and I know I want to get that kind of very Jim Steranko. I'm name dropping a classic comic artist, but I knew I wanted that very graphic computer grid. So I found this piece, but I knew I would need to make it smaller. So in Photoshop, I just duplicated it and made it very symmetrical, as you can see. And then I changed the color scheme to a cooler blue to work with the foreground colors of my foreground Cyberman portrait. And that only left the eyes. And I didn't just want to have the background. I wanted to give it its own depth. So I gave it a miniature grid and added the shading to give it that depth. So the process I'll be showing you on all these Doctor Who villains is this process. Once I get the finished illustration, is then to return to show you the photograph that I originally started with, and how the art of photo illustration is turning it into this. And then, as a promotional vehicle, this past month in October, leading up to Halloween, I decided to write haikus for each one. So again, based on my research into what each of these villains were about, the Cyberman is augmented human, emotions none, hungers for, immortality. And I guess the more you know about Doctor Who, if you're a Doctor Who junkie or Doctor Who fan at whatever level, you'll know that each of the haikus that I'm going to share with you are pretty much right on the money as to what these are about. But they were really fun to write. And then here's how. There we go. Here's how the whole promotional piece that I posted on my social media in the month of October. And of course, you can see down below, I chose midnight on Halloween, 12:01 a.m. on the 31st, because that's the same day that the BBC dropped the brand new season of Doctor Who. And I think it's the last season with Jodie Whittaker as the female Doctor Who. Now, Doctor Who, as I mentioned, of course, has this 62-year history. So the next villains, the Daleks, they go way back to the very beginning. And this is what they look like, folks. And to me, they're kind of funny looking, but they're very serious villains. I mean, they really do. They wreak a lot of havoc, and you can see their undersides. It reminds me, I'm going to name drop a classic 60s sci-fi series, The Invaders with Roy Thinnes. The bottoms of the Daleks look like the bottoms of those spaceships from that particular short-lived series. I think 2 seasons it lasted. But I kept looking for the right Dalek image to become a portrait. And, you know, it's kind of a not too fun of an image to illustrate. But I think I finally landed on this one. It was the most direct and kind of in your face Dalek. And then I figure, you know, it's so mechanical. I got to make this more of an illustration. So by giving it a rougher pencil drawing, it's kind of working in a frisson, I hope, as opposed to being incongruous to the machinery itself, trying to give it a more organic feel. I lay in my Photoshop coloring, and then I figure, okay, we need a background that's got a little of excitement. So I do the classic, what I call Jack Kirby, Joe Sinnott, burst lines. I'm sure every artist has their own version of what these are, but they're the classic go-to effect for giving any image that's static a little bit of energy, because there's really, again, not much you can do with these Daleks. So in Photoshop, I take them, I blur them, I add a little color. I knew I want to work the blue against the blue background against the kind of a warm golds and oranges of the Dalek. Anyway, the background wasn't done. It needed more. And in my photo research, I noticed a lot of photographs of the Daleks emerging from the classic blue, you know, science fiction, Steven Spielbergian haze. And I must have Googled and found, you know, blue mist, or however I must have found. I forget whether this might be a composite image from a piece of photo reference. But if we go back to our Dalek image with our blurred burst lines, and you lay in the mist on top of it, and yet you can still sense the forest lines there, but I still felt the foreground was not part of the background enough. So I darkened the foreground and merged it more. And then last but not least, you should use these very deftly, but the classic lens flare on the top for the camera gives it that final little touch. And once again, photo illustration, original photo reference into a photo illustration. And our Dalek haiku, warrior mutant, genetically engineered, not metal, alive. I think that pretty much, even if you don't know what a Dalek is, that tells you all you need to know. Moving on, we have, believe it or not, the creator of the Daleks. This guy's name is Davros. Again, we're moving in alphabetical order, but it kind of works out that after the Daleks. But as I did my research, I found out about this guy that he created them, but they also like abuse him. Like he uses them and they use him, and he's kind of, I guess, a semi-pathetic, tragic figure. I don't know. But finally, I settled on this image as being the most portrait-like. And then once again, the pencil drawing coming from that photograph. Now, this is, I think, when I darken it up in Photoshop. Not all of the images you're going to see did I maintain all of the original pencil drawings, because as I'll explain later, I do many of these pencil drawings in pieces and then assemble them in Photoshop. But if you notice, the mouth is different from the original photograph. I took it from, remember this photograph? See? So I merged, again, that's the art of photo references. You use different pieces of different photographs sometimes. Here's the Photoshop coloring laid in. The foreground. Now you can see I went with the kind of purples to harmonize with the purple surrounding the eye. But again, the background needed those forest lines to give it a little impact. Blurred them once again. But then I lay in the blue, all because the original eye are those colors, that blue and purple. So that governed the kind of comic, the palette. And then a last little lens flare gives it that just little boost, that little extra 10%. Once again, the original photo reference. Remember, the mouth is different. And the photo illustration. Davros, Dark Lord of Skaro, creator of the Daleks, who abuse him. From the Daleks, we go to the Dream Lord who exists between, shadow and reality, very Twilight Zone-ish. Of course, you recognize this actor, Toby Jones, I believe is his name. I hope I'm getting his name right. I might be blanking on it. There wasn't a lot of photo reference on him, but when I found a couple of these pieces, and then there was, I guess, this piece. And when we bring it in, I thought, yeah, this is about the one. So there's my pencil drawing, again, darkened up. And the reason why I'm showing you the darkened up pencil versus the original scan of the pencil, but you'll be seeing some of those a little later, is because I do them in pieces and assemble them. And that's a whole nother reason why they're done in pieces. But suffice to say, the Photoshop color gets laid in. Now for a background, as I did my Google reference, I wanted that dreamy sky, Twilight Zone-ish background. So I found this image when I must have Googled, I don't know, starry backgrounds maybe. Took out the ladder and I laid in, I guess, clouds down below from some other photo reference, and I dropped that into the background. Now we got warm against cool, but he needed to be part of the dreamscape. So the first thing that I did was lay in a little darker tone, but then the reds, the warms of his clothes, I needed to change them. So only the red bow tie, which was his kind of trademark little sartorial display. And then you can see I blended the background into the foreground a little, leaving only the classic lens flare at the right point in the forehead to give it that glint that bridges the background with the foreground. But still, I felt it was still too, in a sense, bright in the foreground. And when I finally laid in the final tone, it all came together. The foreground dreamlike figure merges with the background and makes the lens flare glint even more of a perfect effect. Once again, the original photograph and my photo illustration. And our haiku for the Dream Lord. Two realities let loose by psychic pollen. Folks, don't ask me to explain. You got to do your own research. Psychic pollen, good luck with that. But he is a dark version of Who, meaning Doctor Who. That leads us to the Ice Warriors, who are, according to the history of Doctor Who, one of the oldest villains, goes way back. I'm not maybe showing you all the different Ice Warrior, different permutations. I was almost going to go with this very centered image, but once I saw this photograph, this felt more personable and more, again, portrait-like. So in Photoshop, I manipulated it into position, composition-wise for the 8x10 proportion. And then once again, the art of drawing from a photograph. There is my original scan pencil. And then when we darken it up and finish it up, again, folks, I used to ink these with, felt tip marker on paper and scan it in. And I know people are inking on a Cintiq right on the screen, but I kind of like the organic feeling of my pencils being dark enough for reproduction. And once you lay in, of course, the Photoshop color, you get the best of both worlds. For a background, I chose to, excuse me one second. Okay. They happen to be from Mars, believe it or not. So I must have used this photograph. Maybe I blurred it a little, dropped it into the background. And then there's always the finishing touches to, again, kind of bring the background and the foreground together. I thought darkening the bottom of the red eyes and adding the slight lens flare to his forehead there gave it the right finishing touch. And once again, the original photo reference and my photo illustration and the Ice Warrior haiku. Reptile humanoid needs ice cold environment from the planet Mars. Yeah, I kind of reveal that. So, but yeah, there it is, Ice Warrior. Now we get to these characters called the Masters. There are 3 Doctor Who Masters. By the way, I did not choose these villains. There are more than 18 Doctor Who villains in the 60-year span of the character's TV career. But I basically, as an illustrator of the book cover, I needed to know from David Bushman, the editor of the book. I said, I can fit 18 villains on the wraparound cover. So you give me the 18 top villains. And in fact, give me the top 9 and I'll put them on the front cover. And that's how I ended up kind of laying out where the villains go in which squares. But there were 3 master characters, and this is the first one. This guy's interesting because, according to lore, he posed as the British Prime Minister. I mean, these are villains of Doctor Who, and in order to take over the human race or whatever their plans are, they're able to adopt disguises. Listen, don't ask me. It's like telling you the history of Star Trek. That's how rich the history of Doctor Who is. But you can see when I found this image, I said, that's the one. It's like looking when you're doing photo reference, it's just like looking at contact sheets of photography. You got to find the one that just has that usually it's the eye contact, the connection. But yeah, this photograph was the one. And then it needed more. And I found this image of the character projecting, a ray, a blast of science fiction ray blast out of his palms. And I just added that photograph in Photoshop to where it would be if the background photo model put his hand in front of the camera. And my pencil drawing. And remember, I said I do these things in pieces. I do the backgrounds. I think I did the top of the hair because when you're working from a photograph, sometimes you have to work from different light exposures of that photograph in order to make the pencil drawing. But here is my darkened pencil with, in Photoshop, the added my pencil of his sweatshirt. And then the Photoshop coloring gets laid in, which, by the way, is a whole art unto itself, that I can't be a magician revealing all my tricks. But suffice it to say, when I say I lay in the Photoshop color, there's multiple steps to get to even the point that you're looking at. And then for a background, I thought the classic concentric circles, if I blew them up and blurred them and had them emanate right from where I knew the palm would be, blurred them, added the coloring to harmonize with the foreground. And then I found this photograph of a hand that I thought worked really well. And that hand ended up being this hand that I penciled, made darker, colored, and then I blurred it in Photoshop as if it were out of focus if the character's hand went right up to the camera like it's doing. And then I laid in my ray gun blast, and voila, the finished illustration. Once again, the original photo reference and the photo illustration. Master One, Time War Warrior, the master of all matter, and British PM. Yeah, don't ask me to explain that, but do your research. I'm sure it's a fun one. Master Two happens to be a woman, and her name is Missy. And there's a reason why she's called Missy. There wasn't a lot of photo reference for her. And in fact, the only one that I was able to find that I felt was portrait-like was this one. So first thing I did was I dropped out the background so I could make my pencil drawing from that photograph. And there's the original scan. Before I darkened it up in Photoshop, lay it in the Photoshop color. Now, the reason why I gave it this dark foreground coloring is I knew what I wanted to do with this image. I wanted to turn it into a Lichtenstein-like comic book style image, because I thought, it's the first woman in the lineup. And I wanted to do something that would really jolt you from this very Victorian foreground. So I did this wraparound cover years ago for this Jay Cantor book on Great Neck. As you can see, they wanted a Lichtenstein type explosion. So that's what I gave them. Well, I used that art and I manipulated it around and laid it in the back, and there's our finished Missy Master Number 2 image. And once again, original photograph, photo illustration. She's called Missy because Missy's for mistress. Turned dead men to Cybermen. But she repented. Yes, indeed. That brings us to Master 3. Now, Master 3, I could barely find any usable photo reference. This might have been the first piece I saw. And it ended up, sometimes folks, you got to go with what you're given. And I said, okay, what am I going to do with this image? It's all I got. Well, it starts with the pencil drawing. Now, remember I said I do these things in pieces. Suffice to say, I did this one in pieces, the hair, and then I put them all together in Photoshop, darken it up, and come up with that. Lay in my Photoshop color. And then I thought, I did a woman in dots. Why not give this image a little more oomph? I think in the comic book dots, I go, why not? It makes it a little bit more pop. I found a background that I must have had in my files of a space background, but it was purple. And I thought, oh, color-wise, perfect. So I turned that into dots in Photoshop, brought that and merged it, and added the little lens flare there effect. So once again, we get the original photograph and the photo illustration. Master 3, killed MI6O. The Cassavan he betrayed, lost to Sharmas. Again, folks, you got to be a Doctor Who fan to appreciate my beautiful haikus, because trust me, I did my research. That brings us to Midnight Entity. This was only one episode. Some of these villains obviously are in multiple episodes over multiple seasons. Some villains, like Midnight Entity, was only in one episode, but obviously she was deemed an important enough Doctor Who villain to be included in this august lineup that I was given. And the Midnight Entity was this literal, formless entity from that inhabited a planet, and it needed human beings to be like the host. And the Midnight Entity entered this woman that was on a space flight with the Doctor Who characters that passed by the planet, and the planet was able to inhabit this particular woman. So the woman herself is just an innocent victim of the Midnight Entity, and that she has powers and wreaks havoc, and I guess you have to watch the episode. But I was kind of looking again for the image that would be best portrait wise, and I thought this image really stares right out at you. And there's my pencil drawing, darkened up, the Photoshop color. I needed to lighten the hair, so I added white over the hair, knowing I would be laying in the golden hues of her hair. Now, to contrast that, I had this classic flare burst background in my files, and that made for a good contrast with the foreground. But again, I needed to unite the foreground with the background, and that's what did it. Gave it a more of a ghostly appearance. But for the finishing touch, the classic lens flare gives it that perfect Spielbergian X-Files type aura that once again comes from the original photograph, but turned into a photo illustration. Cold planet midnight, possessing human beings, loving their warm blood. Oh yeah, when it inhabits them, I guess it kills them. Anywho, it was supposedly a great episode. It had to be included. That brings us to the Time Lords. Now, the Time Lords are, I think they go way back to the beginning with the Doctor Who saga, but there's this whole struggle for control of time, and the Time Lords wreak havoc. And what can I tell you? And if that guy looks familiar, the head Time Lord, Lord President, I think they call him, that's Timothy Dalton. The only Bond I liked after Connery was Dalton, because he was dark haired and had that kind of Connery feel, but he was the right man at the wrong time. But he was the right man at the right time to be a Time Lord. Well, again, there wasn't a lot of photo reference, so I had to work with what I got. So I took out the background and I ended up making this pencil drawing from that reference. Now, I assembled it from multiple sources. The rod and staff and foreground hand I took from this photograph. So once again, it's knowing how to mix and match. Yeah, it's kind of like being Dr. Frankenstein when you put together photo illustration in terms of assembling different photo sources into a cohesive image that you unite through your craft of illustration, if that makes any sense. Now, for the face, I had these photographs that I ended up taking, and in Photoshop, I think I had a different top to the hair. I don't know. Don't ask me how this ended up looking like it did, but from that came my pencil drawing, which I then darkened up. And that became the composite, the Frankenstein monster. Now, for the background, I did my research into Doctor Who, and the Time Lords have this recurring mantra-like symbol. Not mantra, what am I thinking of? There's a word for these circular, I just blanked on it. But anyway, I thought this image would be perfect as a background. And I laid it right in there, laid in my Photoshop coloring. And then I must have colored the face larger and dropped it in. And there's the Photoshop color for the face. And all it needs, of course, is the classic lens flare, a little darkening on the foreground of the face. And there you have the finished Time Lord illustration. His name is Rassilon, Time Lord President. Again, from photo reference beginnings to finished photo illustration. Rassilon, Time Lord President, the final sanction, his dream of pure consciousness. The Silurians, they're a reptile. Oh, sorry, I hit that too soon. I wanted to show you this image because they are among the very original Doctor Who villains, I think, from the first season in 1962. And in this piece I found on the internet, you can see how this kind of reptile humanoid, obviously more reptile humanoids than Doctor Who, has mutated over the years until the more current look that you see in these photographs. See, Doctor Who, I think the original 1962 series, I forget when it ended, but I know it started up again, I think in 2005 or maybe 2007. But I don't know what that gap was before, because again, I wasn't a Doctor Who fan. This image, I think I was almost going to use until I found this particular photograph, which when I took it and tilted it, thought would be a perfect portrait. So there is my pencil drawing. Remember, I said I work in pieces, so I must have drawn the eyes separately and the other pieces of the body and darkened it in Photoshop to give you the finished pencil drawing. The Photoshop color is laid in. Now for a background, I must have put reptile textures or something in Google, and I found the image. You can see the crease in the middle is where I just flop the top half in Photoshop. And then I dropped that background, but I still felt it needed more. So first I gave the figure a little white glow, because now the reptile background lines begin to look like energy lines, like electricity. So I thought, why don't I enhance that effect with the classic burst lines? Because when I blur them and add some color and then merge it with the reptile skin, watch what happens. You get this effect. And then the foreground, again, needed a little darker definition. And voila, the finished illustration. Here's the original photo reference. And the photo illustration. The Silurian, humanoid reptile, predating the dawn of man, thinks of men as apes. Yeah, the Silurians look down on man, according to my research. And that brings us to the Slitheen. The Slitheen, I think, Slitheen, I believe. And yeah, that's who this character looks like. Now, sometimes, remember, you have to be a Frankenstein to kind of assemble from various photo references a composite that forms a better composition. So it was from this composite that I put together in Photoshop from multiple pieces of photo reference of this character. And then I did my pencil drawing. This is the darkened up version. I lay in my Photoshop coloring in the foreground, lay in the background to harmonize. And this one needed the classic all-important glint over the shoulder, subtle, but it's there, lens flare effect. So the original photo reference, again, a composite made up of multiple photographs, and the finished photo illustration. The Slitheen, yes, did I get that right? Yes, Slitheen. Alien outlaws wear human skin disguises to ruin the earth, those bastards from another planet. Yeah, they're even outlaws on their own planet or something like that. That brings us to the Santaran. They're a race of military warriors who think they're the greatest in all the galaxy, even though this is their ogre-like appearance. Now, I was again looking for the right one. I don't know why I didn't go with this face. Maybe I should have, but you can see I like the foreground spear of this one. But I must have settled on this composite of, I think this is made up of 3 different photographs. I think the head, I think the neck brace is from another photograph, and then the spear, maybe even the shoulders. This is, again, a Frankenstein composite that, once again, I penciled in stages, in pieces, and then assemble them in Photoshop. And there's the finished pencil drawing. And again, I like the rawness of my pencil against the very high-tech science fiction because, again, it gives it a little bit more of human warmth, especially when you're working from photographs. So I like that kind of frisson, if I'm using that word correctly. There's the Photoshop coloring for the head. Foreground. And then in my research, I found this photograph and I thought, I could use that background because it's got that same purple pink to unite with the foreground. And then a little lens flare in the foreground, spear, and his cheek there gives it that final little 10% touch to make the illustration come alive. And here's the photo reference. Again, a Frankenstein monster composite and the finished illustration. The Sontaran, militaristic, galaxy's finest soldiers, taters with ray guns, as I think Doctor Who described them, or some character in my research said, they're just taters with ray guns. Anywho, now we get this guy, Taran Capel, Caren Capel. And his whole story is about robots. Capel itself, the name, is an homage to Capek, the Czech author who wrote R.U.R., Rossum's Universal Robots, the first in 1920 something, the first use of the word robot. And his name is Capek, translated C-A-P-E-K. So this is Taran Capel, but he was raised by robots. He even led a robot revolution against their human masters or something. But in the end, he himself was killed by like one of his subservient robots or something like that. But so his story has a very tragic irony to it. But you can see in this photo reference, that was really the only usable piece I could find. He even painted himself to resemble the robots, and he dressed like one with the silver outfit there. Very Andy Warhol factory-like. But I ended up taking that photograph, putting it into my 8x10, and then I did my pencil drawing from it. And that's the darkened up version. I lay in the Photoshop color. I figure the green foreground needs another purple background. I think this is a blurred piece of some kind of purple jewels, and I blurred it, I think. And that really harmonized well with the silvery foreground. And there's the finished illustration. There's our photo reference. Kind of dark and dreary. And if this is all you got to turn it into this. So it just looks more alive, I think. Taran Capel was raised by robots, led robot revolution, killed by a robot. Yeah, just like I said. But that's a haiku, folks. And trust me, if you're going to count my syllables, I've counted them multiple upon multiple times. 5, 7, 5. And that brings us to the silence, this weird looking alien race. And yeah, they're really creepy looking. Reminds me of that Stephen King movie, The Mist or The Fog or whatever it was called. The Mist, maybe. About 12 years ago, and the beasts that appear throughout and especially at the end. But once again, I'm looking for the right piece. I thought maybe this would be it, but then I saw this photograph. But I had to manipulate in Photoshop because the eyes were too dark to see. So I manipulated to bring out the eyes. That way, when I made my pencil drawing, it would have looked like that. Now, I must have done this in pieces as well, because look at the final pencil has added lines when I darkened it up. There's the Photoshop color laid in. Now, I thought the background for this one needed something minimalist, like the essential foreground. You know, I was almost going to make this a black and white illustration, but I thought, you know, they're all color. But why not a pure black and white background? So this is classic zipatone we used to call in the pre-computer days. But now you can just make that same effect in Photoshop. But I thought it made the perfect background for, so you get a colorful black and white image in the foreground with a pure black and white background. And there's the original photo reference and the photo illustration. The silence is a religious order. The first question, Doctor Who? The answer, Time War. Folks, do your research. You can figure what all that means. But trust me, it's accurate. That brings us to maybe my favorite, only because it's so wacky looking. And this villain's name is a name you wouldn't expect, Vashta Narada. It sounds, I guess, Indian almost, Vashta Narada, and it's not actually what you see. Vashta Narada, you see that background in this photo reference? It looks like, you know, a hail of something, but those are actually the swarm of beings, micro beings, and they inhabited the spacesuit. And I don't know, don't ask me how the skull got in the space. I guess it was dead astronauts, and that's the skull of the, again, you know, you got to just trust me on this, but this is a real popular character. I don't know how many times Vashta Narada appeared, but I found this photo reference. This is from cosplay at some Doctor Who convention. But I thought, you know, I can use that. So this is the photo composite I ended up taking from that piece. You can see I took out what I didn't want. And then I found this photograph of the perfect skull. So I dropped that in, and that became, in a sense, the base of the photo reference that I was able to make my initial pencil drawing of. You can see I added another hand from another source. The initial Photoshop coloring is dropped in. Now, for some reason, again, based on the research, this character's episode took place in some kind of library or something. So I did my research, my photo research, into I put in library shelves, and I wanted a dramatic angle of library shelves. So I took that photograph, but then the color scheme was wrong. It needed to be that, again, that science fiction-y blue. And that way, when I dropped it in and blurred it, it merged with it harmonized with the foreground skull color. But again, those 10% final touches, like the reflection, gives that whole face of the spacesuit, the helmet, it gives it that real three-dimensional feeling. And then the lens flare effect at the top gives it that real spectral feel that you want in an illustration that features a skull in a spacesuit. So once again, folks, finished illustration, photo reference, photo illustration, Vashta Narada, small swarms in spacesuits. Folks, you got to give me some props on my alliteration within these haikus, you know. The shadows that melt the flesh. Piranhas that fly. Oh, isn't that nice? And that brings us to the weeping angels. You can see they are very, very popular, the weeping angels. They've got this kind of Medusa-like power to freeze you, or I don't know. They're very murderous. These angels. They ain't no angels. Once again, in finding my photo research, sometimes you get to the right photograph and you're like, yeah, that's the one. So I just needed to tilt it a little. And that became my composite. Again, I do it in pieces. And that's the darkened version of my pencil of the main figure. The Photoshop coloring laid in. I went back to that great lens flare, but I changed the color from the blue more to the grayish tones that would harmonize well with the foreground stone gray of the figure. And then I penciled the hands separately and colored it and then blurred it in Photoshop with motion blur to give it that subtle motion. And then from this piece of photo reference, I took that great hand on the right. Yeah, perfect. And with a little Photoshop motion blur, they really look like they're just subtly moving enough to really make the illustration come alive, but not fully alive until you add the little glint and the little lens flare that just gives it that je ne sais quoi for a finished illustration. Notice the little glint on the tooth as well, the fang, I should say. Once again, photo reference and photo illustration. Weeping angel, hands cover its face, prevents petrification, murderous devil. And that brings us to our final. Z is for Zygon. They're an alien race that, again, I think they might be one of the original Doctor Who villains. I don't know, but they came to Earth hundreds of years ago and were mistaken for the Loch Ness Monster or something like that. So not a lot of photo reference, but this I thought was a natural. It was the only one that really worked as a portrait. So there's my pencil drawing darkened up. Photoshop color laid in. I believe they're also from Mars because you can see the background image. It's a composite of various Mars, I don't know, photo reference, but you can see I had a perfect upper right corner that I knew I would be able to use. And I thought that the arc of the planet background combined with the arc of the Zygon's kind of neck completed the circle. So compositionally, that's why I did it. And then again, the finishing touches, a glow added to the planet and to the foreground edge lighting of the Zygon. And as always, giving it that foreground backlighting to really make the halo of the image shine. And there's the original photo reference and the finished image. Shapeshift aliens came to England way back when as Loch Ness Monster. So there it is, folks, combined together into a poster the villains of Doctor Who. When you go to my poster site, popcultureman.com, which, by the way, is also linked from arlenschumer.com. But when you go to popcultureman.com, you'll see a homepage that looks like this. You can get the poster in 2 different sizes. And when you click on the individual images, they pop up, the 16 by 20 of all 18 villains. And again, from my homepage of my website, you can see down below clickable links to Pop Culture Man. And in the center, TeePublic is a merchandising site that I have over 125 of my images as every kind of application, knick-knack, tchotchke, gewgaw you can think of. So support your local freelance artists. And then on my website, there's pages about my comic book history projects, like my book, The Silver Age of Comic Book Art, which you can order through my website, popcultureman.com. You can see that it's made up of double-page spreads of really the art. There's never been a book about the art in comic book art. And then I take out the original word balloons and put the artist talking about the art. So down below, that's Jack Kirby on the left-hand page telling you how he created Galactus. I run a Facebook group about Jack Kirby's work, Jack Kirby and Company. So if you're on Facebook, you can friend me or put in an invite, or however you do it, ask to be invited, and et cetera, et cetera. I also run a Facebook group on the artists who influenced my work the most, Neil Adams, and a third on the Silver Age of comic book art itself, essentially the 1960s. Then there's on my website, my visual lectures and webinars page, which you can go to, and that's linked as well to my YouTube page, which has videos of my recent webinars and my pre-pandemic live lectures, which I hope to return to. I also have a Vimeo page for videos of things that usually for copyright reasons, YouTube rejects. So you can see Bruce Springsteen, Twilight Zone, James Bond, Batman, these were all rejected by YouTube, but Vimeo, I guess, has thankfully much laxer restrictions. So those again are my 2 channels to see previous webinars and live lectures. Now, speaking of webinars, next week, next Wednesday at exactly the same time, I'll be doing yet another Twilight Zone webinar on Twilight Zone Noir. And I am doing that originally for a class taught by David Bushman, the editor of the Doctor Who Villains book. And he teaches a class on film noir at Ramapo College in New Jersey. And he invited me to lecture his class on how the Twilight Zone relates to film noir, knowing how much of a Twilight Zone fan and scholar that I am. And I was like, absolutely. And I can't, so not only am I doing it for his class first next Monday, but then on Wednesday, I'll be doing it for everybody as another free webinar. So if you go to arlenschumer.com to the events page, excuse me, to the events page, I post, excuse me, I post all of my comings and goings, and it's various links. So you can always go there. So thank you again, ladies and gentlemen, for attending the Villains of Doctor Who, the Art of Photo Illustration webinar. Bye-bye. Thanks for attending this presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. And please remember to click the subscribe or follow button on your platform screen to be notified of all of my upcoming pop culture presentations. And visit my website, arlenschumer.com, to sign up for my newsletter too. Until next time, I'm Arlen Schumer. Bye-bye.